What's something your parents believe that you don't?
They told me they were taking my brothers on a week away because they had earned a break and because I, the serious one, should focus on school instead. And I stood in the kitchen with a dish towel in my hand listening to my mother talk about flights and resorts and my father joke that I would probably prefer a quiet house and a stack of textbooks anyway, and I nodded because that was the part one had learned to play. The quiet girl who makes everything smooth while everyone else gets to be celebrated, and if I tell you I smiled, it was that polite, tired smile you use when you have already heard the punchline for years. You would think I would argue, but I did not, because arguing in my family only ever felt like volunteering to be the villain, and when you grow up with two golden boys who get high fives for basic competence while you get told that you are too intense, you learn to preserve your energy, so I just said something like have a great time and I hope your connections work so you can send pictures, and my mother laughed and said that was the spirit, and my father said they would bring me something small, and my brothers smirked like gifts were somehow a currency I owed them, and I made a mental note that when people promise you something small, they usually mean it. I wish I could say the vacation was the first time they left me behind, but it was the easiest to see, a bright neon sign without the neon, because before that there were years of small choices that stack up until they look like architecture. Small birthdays I planned for other people, small favors I delivered without thanks, small rules that applied only to me, and meanwhile there were expensive trips to baseball stadiums and music festivals and a last-minute weekend to the desert for my brothers because they needed brother time, while my requests were measured, weighed, and found impractical, and if I asked for space or time or even a simple dinner for once, there was always a lecture about priorities and gratitude and how I should remember that stability is not a guarantee. When they said focus on school, I wanted to laugh, because the part none of them ever kept track of was that I had been the one who filled out the financial aid forms, the long one with the ridiculous questions about household income and assets that my mother always avoided, and I had scheduled every advising appointment and hunted down every fee waiver and called the registrar when something broke. And I had paid the water bill for months when my father forgot to set up autopay because apparently competence becomes your personality when people decide it is more convenient to assign you that job than to learn it themselves. So I did what I do, which is plan quietly, and if you think planning is cold, you have never had to choose between anger and sanity, because I chose sanity and made lists and took pictures of everything that was actually mine. From the car title to the old laptop receipt to the credential cards I earned with my own work, and I set up a small storage unit across town and a separate bank account with my own direct deposit, and I told no one, not because I was sneaky, but because I was done asking permission to control my own life. The night before they left, my mother hugged me like I was a child who needed reassurance and said, "We will FaceTime you from dinner, say something witty for the group chat." And I said sure and wished them a smooth trip and then watched them roll their suitcases to the car that I paid to insure, and I kept my hands still at my sides because the list in my head had a timing to it, and there was no satisfaction in spoiling the rhythm by throwing a scene in the driveway. Once the garage door shut, I stood in the quiet kitchen and let the silence register, and then I moved, not frantic, not dramatic, just deliberate, pulling the box of documents I had already gathered, locking the folder with every certificate and record, lifting down the frame with the photo of me at graduation and sliding the picture into a protective sleeve, and I opened the mobile app for the family plan that is, inconveniently for them, in my name because I once got a discount through work. And I removed my brothers from the insurance on the car I own and took the spare keys from the hook where they always hung like a dare, and I placed them in my bag, because I knew that while they were at the airport bragging about free upgrades, the car they loved to borrow without asking was becoming mine again in practice, not just on paper. If you are wondering whether that felt petty, I will tell you that it felt like oxygen, because I had spent years being told that it was my job to keep the family running while my brothers practiced being adored. And all I did in that moment was stop subsidizing the fantasy, and if that counts as revenge, then it is the kind that looks a lot like fairness when the lights are on. By the time their plane took off, I had changed the cloud settings to remove my images from the shared albums and downloaded them to my drive. Not because I wanted to erase history, but because I was done leaving pieces of myself scattered in places where they could be used as proof that I belonged only as a decoration. And I wrote a short note and sealed it in an envelope with my name on it and placed it in the drawer where my mother keeps the spare checks, and I stacked 2 suitcases at the door with everything I needed for the next chapter, and when the sun came up the house felt lighter, not because anything mystical had happened, but because I had finally decided that my value does not live here anymore, and if you think that was the end of it, keep listening, because the real message was not the boxes or the keys or the note. It was the plan I set in motion while they were posting airport selfies they thought I would like, and it begins with the fact that when they come back, they will find no photos, no clothes, and no me. While their plane inched across the map and the family chat filled with jokes about airport snacks and upgrades I was apparently too serious to appreciate, I sat at my desk and opened the folder that had been growing for years with every ignored receipt and every bill I had covered, because it was easier to be confident than to argue. And I looked at that quiet stack of proof that my role in this house had never been daughter or sister so much as unpaid manager, after which I did the one thing no one in my family ever expects me to do, which is act for myself without asking permission, and the relief that followed was not loud, not dramatic, just steady, like finally stepping off a treadmill I never agreed to run. I started with the accounts that had my name on them because practicality is not cruelty and ownership still means something when the noise dies down, so I logged into the insurance portal and confirmed what I had already done. Removing my brothers as covered drivers on a car I bought, registered, and insured while they played at Independence with borrowed wheels and gas cards, then I moved on to the subscriptions that had somehow become communal without ever being discussed, the streaming platforms and meal services and shared storage plans that were set up on my card, because I had the patience to create passwords and remember them, and I ended each one with a polite note to myself in a spreadsheet labeled restitution. Not because I planned to send anyone a bill, but because I wanted an honest record of the work they never saw and the quiet generosity they were never going to admit. I thought about the old fights that were never really fights, those gentle parent lectures where love sounded like a budget meeting and fairness got framed as selfishness if it was requested by the wrong child, and I let that history guide my next moves, which were not fueled by rage but by clarity, because when you have been trained to be grateful for crumbs, the first full plate you serve yourself feels suspicious, so I kept checking my instincts, asking whether I was being vindictive or simply returning weight to the shoulders that had dropped it onto mine, and each time the answer was the same, which is that if you carry everyone you teach them how to ride. I called the bank and separated the last shared account that had survived through convenience and laziness. The one everyone pretended was family money, even though every deposit with my name on it had come from extra shifts and freelance work I took while my brothers napped off hangovers and my parents praised them for being social. And I listened as the representative confirmed that notifications would now come to me alone. Then I moved on to the family phone plan I had kept because I once qualified for a work discount and no one else wanted to deal with the paperwork, and I migrated my line to a solo plan while scheduling theirs to end on the last day of the billing cycle with a note that said, "Please contact your own provider," which is not ruthless. It is adulthood. With the logistics moving, I addressed the part of the story that used to make me feel disloyal, the part where extended relatives and neighbors thought my brothers were hardworking and I was humorless. Because that narrative had been curated by the same people who posted photos I took and captions I wrote while tagging me as the photographer like that was a compliment. So I drafted a message that did not insult anyone and did not name names. It simply thanked the scholarship committee that had covered my last semester when family priorities shifted, and it attached a link to an article about first-generation students carrying household responsibilities, and I scheduled it to go live the day after their return, trusting that the right people would connect the dots without me drawing them in thick marker. Then I packed the last items that were truly mine, not the sentimental things my mother would weaponize during a guilt tour, and not the gadgets my brothers called communal, just the documents, the hard drives, the few gifts I had bought for myself and hid in plain sight, and I carried them to the storage unit whose code lives only in my head, after which I sat in my small sublet and mapped the next weekend blocks, a meeting with HR to update my address, a consultation with a counselor to untangle the habit of apologizing for taking up space, a visit to the dealership to replace the car's remote fob and disable the spare they liked to keep on the kitchen hook, as if that meant the vehicle belonged to the household. And with each line item, I felt less like someone running away and more like someone walking home. Before I went to sleep, I wrote one message and sent it not to my parents, not to the group where sarcasm passes for affection, but to my brothers directly, telling them with no heat and no theatrics that the car is off limits, the accounts are closed, the streaming passwords will no longer work, and that they should plan accordingly because grown people figure out their own access. And I ended with a line they would not appreciate until much later, which was that generosity without boundaries raises dependence, not family, after which I turned off my phone and let the silence do its job, because the real revenge was never about punishing them on vacation. It was about handing them their adult lives in a plain envelope labeled now. And the cliff they will step onto without noticing is coming up fast, since the moment they land and try to ride the old currents, they will realize the water no longer moves for them, and that the first wave of consequences arrives the second my scheduled cancellations kick in tomorrow morning. The morning after their departure, I walked through the house that had trained me to be useful and unnoticeable, and I treated every room like a ledger that needed to be corrected. Starting with my bedroom, where I slid hangers across the rail and folded the clothes I had bought with my paychecks and tucked them into suitcases already lined with packing cubes. Then moving to the desk drawer where the receipts and warranties and certificates I had collected for years waited like quiet witnesses. And as I stacked each document into the fireproof folder I had labeled with my own name, I kept thinking how ridiculous it was that I used to apologize for having boundaries. So I took back what was mine with the same calm I used when I paid the water bill or booked my own doctor's appointment because no one else remembered. I unscrewed the framed photo of my graduation that my mother had placed in the hallway like a participation ribbon, and I slipped the picture out and left the factory paper behind because I was done being the decoration in a house that did not want a full person. Then I moved to the living room where the albums lived, those heavy books that my parents dragged out whenever relatives visited, and I opened them one by one and eased out the prints of my face that had been captioned with lines that sounded like jokes but always hinted at a punchline I was supposed to swallow, and I placed those images in a folder to keep for myself, not to destroy them because history matters to me even when it hurts, but to stop lending myself to a narrative I did not write, and when the spaces in the albums looked oddly blank I did not feel guilty, I felt accurate. After that I opened the shared cloud account on the tablet that sits on the coffee table because my father likes to swipe through photos as if he took them. And I deleted the albums that contained my life and exported them to a drive that would not be accessible from their logins. And then I went a step further and removed my access entirely so that the next time my mother tried to tag me in a memory, she would see that she could not, and maybe she would wonder why controllers lose their grip. The minute the controlled stop participating, which is a delayed lesson, but a clean one. I drove to the post office and set up forwarding for my mail, because I was done with the ritual where my mother stacked my envelopes on the kitchen counter as if her proximity to them proved some kind of care. And I rented a small box under my own name, and I sent a simple email to my clinic and my school and my employer to update my address. And while I was at it, I checked the emergency contact fields, and I replaced my mother's number with the name of a friend who has never once used my struggles as dinner conversation, and I will not pretend that change did not make my chest feel tight, but the feeling was not fear, it was relief layered with a little grief for the version of me that waited for permission to protect herself. Back at the house, I cleared my shelves and drawers with deliberate movements and packed only what I wanted to bring into the next chapter, leaving behind the knickknacks my brothers used to borrow when they needed a quick gift and the childhood souvenirs that my mother would surely wave later like flags of betrayal if I took them. And I wiped down the surfaces because cleaning is how I de-escalate even when I am the one leaving, and I placed my keys on the desk and then thought better of it and put them in my bag, since the only thing a tidy key is good for in this family is proving I am available, which I am not. I took a final lap through the garage and pulled the spare car key from the hook where it hung like a claim stake, and I disabled it at the dealership on my way to the storage unit, and I returned the old fob to the house with a note that said this copy no longer works. Please stop trying to use what you did not earn, and before you tell me that sounds harsh, I will remind you that the kindest sentence a person can hear is the one that tells them the rules just changed and they are responsible for themselves now. In the quiet of my sublet later that night, I wrote a scheduled email that would land in their inbox on the hour they were set to arrive home. A message that was not dramatic and not cruel. It simply explained that my belongings were no longer in the house, that my accounts were separate, that my availability as the fixer they relied on had ended, and that if they wanted to talk to me they could do it without lectures or scorekeeping, and I attached a copy of the titles and receipts they always pretended were community property, so there would be no arguments about what I took, and I ended the note with a single line that they would recognize from the hallway albums now sitting 2 shades emptier on the coffee table, which said that if you do not see a person while she is standing in front of you, prepare to learn her shape by the space she leaves behind, after which I closed my laptop and set my alarm for early morning because the move was finished and the stage was set. And the only thing left was for them to walk into the house they always swore was full and notice the one thing it had never had until now, which is the sound of me being gone. They rolled back into the driveway with sunburns and stories and the easy swagger of people who believe home will pause itself until they return. And while the trunk clicked open and my brothers argued about who carried what and my parents shouted to each other about souvenirs and laundry and whether the thermostat had been left too low, the house met them with the kind of quiet that is not peaceful but pointed, the kind that makes you look around for the missing piece and find that the missing piece has already looked around and chosen herself. So when my mother pushed the door and called my name in that sing-song tone she uses when she wants a chore done fast, the echo that came back did the first job I ever asked it to do, which was to tell the truth. They noticed the closet first, because habit pulls you toward the places where you store assumptions, and when my mother slid the door and reached for a hanger that was no longer there, her hand stayed floating in the empty space like a question she had never dared to ask out loud, after which she went to the hallway and stared at the frames that used to fill a straight line from the entrance to the kitchen, finding that the smiling paper faces remained for everyone else while my slots showed the neat placeholder stock photos, and she said something about a prank while my father frowned in the way he frowns at receipts he does not want to read. Then moved to the coffee table to swipe the tablet for the shared albums and stopped when the screen announced that access for one user had been removed and that some content could not be found, which is a very polite way for a system to say that the unpaid archivist has resigned. My brothers attempted the ritual of entitlement they know by heart, hunting for the spare key to my car on the kitchen hook and tossing the empty ring at each other like a joke while swearing it had to be somewhere. Then thundering out to the driveway to try their luck with a fob that I had already deactivated, and I imagined the moment the door locks refused them, that tiny thud of mechanical honesty that says this is not yours and never was, after which they stomped back inside demanding to know what I was playing at, as if my refusal to subsidize their mobility was a performance instead of a correction, and my father, whose voice grows large when he smells an argument he thinks he can win, announced that he would handle it by calling me, only to learn that the phone plan he had enjoyed, because I once had a discount, now recognized him as an adult who needs his own provider, which eliminated the warm-up and pushed him straight into the main event, the one where you realize you have been living on borrowed passwords and patience. On the kitchen island, I had left an envelope with my name across the front and a steady stack inside that did not rant and did not beg and did not bother with nostalgia. It simply laid out copies of titles and policies and account closures, paired with a concise letter that said the things families like mine refuse to hear unless the words are pinned to paperwork, and in that letter I wrote that I was safe, that my belongings were no longer here, that the accounts I opened and the payments I made would stay with me, that I was not open for lectures, that I would speak only if the conversation did not turn into a courtroom with me cast as defendant, and that the habit of using my confidence as a public utility had ended effective immediately. And, because I know theatrics when I see them, I included a note to my brothers explaining the dates their streaming access would stop and the names of introductory plans for adults who wish to entertain themselves without a sister's credit card. while they circled the kitchen firing off messages I would not receive because my phone had already migrated to a quiet new life. A scheduled post went live on my page that did not name them, and did not drag them, and did not even mention the word family. It simply thanked the scholarship committee that kept me in classes when priorities at home shifted, and it linked to an article about invisible labor that relatives and neighbors began to share with that soft shock people reserve for truths they suspected but never framed, and the phone in the hallway started ringing with questions my parents had never planned to answer because they thought the story about me would always be theirs to tell, and each ring sounded less like noise and more like a mirror. They will say later that I humiliated them, and maybe you will hear that and wonder whether I went too far, but what I did today was not vandalism or cruelty or a stunt. It was a clear return of responsibilities to the hands that had tossed them to me for years. A rebalancing that looks dramatic only to people who got comfortable leaning. And as my father reached for the garage door and my mother clutched the envelope and my brothers tested dead remotes like stubborn children, the silence made one last announcement that they did not yet understand, which was that the most valuable thing they lost today was not access to my car or my photos or my patience. It was the story where I stay small to make them feel big, and although they cannot hear it yet, the next sound they will face is not my voice, it is the echo of their own choices, and it is getting louder by the hour. The day after their homecoming, when the calls began piling up and the messages shifted from breezy jokes to clipped demands, and then to alarm and back again to indignation dressed up as concern, I watched my phone light up on the table of my small sublet, and I let it ring because I had already learned the only useful truth this family ever taught me, which is that nothing good happens when I rush to soothe people who created the fire and then complain about the heat, so I brewed coffee and opened the confirmation from the fellowship director who had written in calm, academic language that my placement for the fall had been approved with a stipend and housing support, a win I had earned on my own while being told to focus on school. And I smiled at the timing not because it punished anyone, but because it finally matched my effort with something other than an errand list. Their first voicemail was a chorus of questions wrapped in that managerial tone my parents reserve for tasks I am expected to complete without complaint. But when the reception kicked in and the house router restarted under a new account that did not include my name, the second voicemail sounded less certain. And by the third, my mother had moved from "what did you do" to "where are you," and my father had moved from "get over here" to "call me back right now," and my brothers had already started performing outrage in the family group thread, carefully ignoring the dates in my letter that explained, with receipts attached, when and how the accounts would roll off and where they could take over with their own cards, which is a thing adults do when the free ride parks itself. I replied once, not by phone and not by chat, but by email with a subject line that said terms, because clarity is kinder than dramatics. And inside I wrote that I was safe and that I would not participate in any conversation that attempted to relitigate ownership or rewrite the past, that I would not be attending any emergency summit at the dining table where I had spent years being told that fairness would be earned later, and that if they wanted to speak with me they could accept 3 simple conditions that were not about money in my pocket, but about truth in daylight. First, a written acknowledgement sent to me and kept private that favoritism had been the operating system of our house, and that my work had been invisible by design. Second, a donation of any size, even a token, to the scholarship fund that kept me enrolled when family priorities shifted, made in my name but credited to the committee publicly, because I wanted the next person like me to have help without debt. 2. People who would use it as leverage. Third, the assumption of all accounts and responsibilities they had placed on me, not with extensions or excuses, but with the understanding that their learning curve was their own. After which we could meet in a neutral place and speak like adults who intend to remain in each other's lives without hostage tactics. There was silence after that, a purer kind than the one that greeted them in the hallway, because this version did not ask for explanation or groveling or theater. It simply asked whether they wanted a relationship with a full person or a maid with a diploma. And by evening my mother had sent the first thing I have ever received from her that felt like it came from the ground instead of a stage, a letter with sentences that wandered and repeated and tripped over themselves the way honesty does when it has not been exercised. in which she wrote that she had been proud in private and careless in public, and that she could not fix the past, but would not deny it anymore. And she attached a receipt from the scholarship site that was small in dollars, but enormous in meaning, and she did not ask me to come home. She asked where she could meet me where I felt safe. I chose a diner where the coffee tastes like burnt determination and the seating is cramped enough to keep speeches short, and I went alone and on my time. And when my parents arrived without my brothers, I could tell someone had done the work of fear management, because the dramatics had been downgraded to that wobbly humility people where when they realize their audience will not clap. And I listened while my father tried to steer the conversation toward misunderstandings, and I redirected him toward patterns, and I told them I had filed a privacy block at school and changed my emergency contacts and moved my number and my mailing address not to hide, but to prevent repeat performances, and I laid out the smallest, clearest future I could tolerate, where we meet in public for a while, where there are no surprise visits, where respect is not traded for logistics, and where we do not talk about my car, my accounts, or my apartment because those topics are closed. The brothers performed their last trick later that night by calling to inform me that my conditions were dramatic and my timing cruel and my donation request manipulative. To which I responded in one long message that adulthood is not a punishment and that if they wanted to impress anyone they could start by impressing the utility company with their own credit history. After which I muted their thread and went back to updating my onboarding documents for the fellowship, and when the program posted a profile of incoming fellows with a quote I had written about first-generation students learning to set boundaries without setting themselves on fire. The neighbors and relatives who like to collect other people's children for decoration shared the link and tagged my parents with a friendliness that cut, and I did not have to say a word because the story had stopped being a defense and started being a mirror. You want to know if it felt like revenge, and I want to tell you it felt like breathing, but there was a moment that felt like a finish line, and it was not dramatic, it was not cinematic. It was a notification that the last shared bill had been transferred out of my name, followed by an email from my mother, short and imperfect but real, that said, "We are learning, we will not be on your accounts again, we will show you instead of tell you," and a picture attached of the hallway where the frames had been rearranged to leave a blank stretch of wall with a sticky note that read "Space reserved when you are ready," which was not pressure and not a plea. It was a promise to earn their way back, and I closed my laptop and stood in the quiet. And I realized I did not need the old house to change shape in order to have a home, because I had built one out of boundaries and proof and choices I made without anyone's permission, and while they went on vacation with sons they worshipped and returned. 2. A house that finally reflected the weight they had put on me. I walked forward into a life where the loudest sound is not my apology, but the door I closed, the locks I turned, the accounts I reclaimed, and the terms I wrote in my own name. And if you are asking whether I won, look at the blank spaces in their albums, listen to the way they say my name now, and understand that the woman they expected to fade taught them to see by leaving nothing for them to lean on but themselves.